Welcome to What the Financial, the show that helps you embrace the elephant and befriend the mouse. For many people, retirement is the elephant in the room. It's too big to plan for, but it's also the mouse in the room. It's those small financial decisions that you avoid or are afraid of making. If you don't have a plan, these decisions can eat through everything you've worked hard for. Your host, Steve Lebens, will help you tame these creatures and answer WTF about your finances.
Welcome to the What the Financial podcast with Steve Lebens of Lebens Advisory Group. I'm Patrice Sikora, and in this episode, Steve will tackle how living longer affects your investment portfolio. Steve, I have to admit, I never thought longevity could be considered a risk, but how do you determine that risk?
Things have changed in our world so much over the last 40 years. Let's kind of set the context of why this topic has come to fruition. 40 years ago, our country was a manufacturing economy. Lots of people had pensions and thought they would live on those. Life expectancy, when the Social Security Act was enacted in 1935, the life expectancy was in the low 60s. Nobody thought at that time when Social Security was created, or even 40 years ago, that people would be living routinely into their 80s, 90s, many people live into their hundreds. So it's become a very hot topic for most of our clients. And it's really been the basis of why these retirement communities have been created all over the country. We're working with clients. The very first step in trying to figure this out is your family. Our typical clients in their 50s or early 60s, when we first start getting engaged with them, and we look at how long their parents lived, or their grandparents, what was their life cycle. So then we can try and paint this picture of what their life really looks like the best we can, because there's always, there's surprises all over the place. But that's really the first step in putting this together.
And that's just looking at the risk, the possibility that they could live a long life?
Yeah, my family, my grandfather on my dad's side died when he was 46. My grandpa on my mom's side lived till he was in his 80s. My dad passed away at 69, but my mom's living at 75. Both my wife's parents are still living in their mid-70s, so we take that into consideration. If you live longer, you have to have a plan for your investments to continue to grow. Most financial planners use the rule of 100 when they're managing assets. And that means, take your age, subtract it by 100, and whatever that number is the percentage of your portfolio that should be in the stock market, and the rest should have full principal protection. So if you're 60 years old, you subtract 60 from 100, that gives you 40. So 40% of your money should be in the stock market. The other 60 should have zero principal risk. But because people are living longer, that doesn't necessarily work anymore. It's a constant
rebalancing.
Yeah, rebalancing to make sure we're having assets that can grow. We almost create pies of their asset. We might target certain money for 75 and beyond, or 85 and beyond, and balance that money appropriately. And life expectancy is continuing to expand because our medical community is getting so much better at treating things. It's a bad thing for people to run out of money when they're, in their retirement years. We work really hard in this community to amass our assets, and to run out is just not a fun thing to do.
Does living longer actually give you more time to invest?
Yeah, it does. And, I have clients who are 84 years old and have a sizable amount of money still invested in the stock market. They're not in, CDs and cash. Let's go back into the 80s, 1980s, if our listeners recall or were around in those days. Inflation was in the teens. CD rates were paying above 10%.
Well,
that looked pretty good today, right?
Yeah.
If you had $100,000 and you got guaranteed 10% insured product from a bank,
it was good unless you were going for a mortgage.
Right, right.
Yeah.
Today, let's fast forward, and a CD rate for 10 years is under 2%.
That's nothing.
That's not exactly. So your income from in the 80s to now is 1/5 what it was on the same amount of money. So that again gives you reason to be invested in the stock market. And typically those older clients will have a big dividend participation. Companies are paying dividends, so they're using it as an income bond proxy. But rates today are so low that you have to, if you need growth or even income, you have to have exposure to the stock market.
Well, does living longer mean you're going to have to work longer?
Not necessarily, but I will say this: retirement today is different than it was for my grandfathers, even my dad. My dad would have just turned 80. The jobs today, because we've evolved into more of a technology world than a manufacturing world, working in retirement can be different. It doesn't have to be so physically exhausting. You can work from home. And people have also, the baby boomer generation were very hard workers. Many of them worked at the same company for 40 years, grinders, just every day, never sick. And then they get to retirement and they somehow are told they don't have to work anymore, but they're used to doing something, so they get bored. So they find a part-time job at a golf course, or helping out at a company, doing just tasks that doesn't wear them out physically. So it's more, to me, there are certainly those situations where people have to supplement income in retirement, but to me it's more of a boredom story,
Mm-hmm.
at least with the clients that we work with, than have to. It's just they want to so they can stay involved.
Is that a good thing to have that extra income coming in? What are they doing with it? Are they investing it, or are they using it so they don't have to tap their investments yet?
Most of our clients, they are using it for more spending money, giving, or to Christmas presents or things of that nature. But of course, there are the stories of people having to, work in retirement just to make ends meet.
We are living longer. We are probably maybe working a little bit longer. Does that mean retirement may be longer? And how do we look at that when it comes to investments?
Yeah, retirement certainly is longer. Full retirement today is 67. Life expectancy is in the early 80s. So from full retirement age, you got 10 to 15 years minimum that you're going to live and have to live off of those assets. What history has shown is that the typical retiree in their first 10 years of retirement spend 50% of their net worth,
Really?
because you've been looking forward to this day. You're healthy, typically. Of course, there's always cases where that's not true, but when people retire, they get, I've been waiting 40 years to retire, and I get to travel, and I get to go maybe get a country club membership and all this stuff. And so they kind of do that. And in the first 10 years, they spend all this money, and then they maybe slow down physically, or they've kind of got their fill of what they really wanted to do. And now they're spending more time with their kids and their grandkids and even great grandkids. Life becomes a little bit more simpler.
Mm-hmm.
Then it becomes more of a transition of, okay, how much money am I going to have to give to my kids or my grandkids when the day comes that I pass away?
And as you go past that what is it, the go, the slow go, and then the no-go? When you get to the no-go, what's with the money? Are people spending anything?
Typically, the clients that we are working with, a big conversation topic is long-term care. 7 out of 10 of us are going to have some sort of long-term care episode in our life, and living in a community, long-term care community, is incredibly expensive. With retirees, that's usually one of our first conversations is, what is the history of your family? Is there any Alzheimer's history in your family? What have people lived in these communities where they've needed daily care? And if so, you have to plan for that as early as possible, because it is incredibly expensive. The average in my home state of Minnesota, for long-term care facility is $78,000 a month. In memory care is pushing $10,000 a month now. So that's all out of pocket cost if you haven't planned for it and got long-term care insurance. So usually by the time our clients get 10, 12 years out from retirement, then it becomes making sure they're taking care of themselves physically as best they're possible and spending time with their families.
What is the 4% rule? Explain that to me.
4% rule is a textbook rule of client would take 4% of their investable assets out every year and they would never run out of money. That's great in a textbook, but most people are going to need more than 4% in a typical year. It's a great tool to use to start talking about costs. We hope that when our clients get to retirement age, they're sitting on very little debt, so we can control the outgoing expenses. If you retire with a bunch of money but a bunch of debt, you're going to have a really hard time. The 4% rule works great if your clients are portfolios are balanced properly and their debt load isn't very high.
Wow.
So we usually use it as a conversation topic point of here's what we typically like to see a minimum, but in most cases, it's not going to apply.
As we're getting older and our investments are getting older, tell me about how the risk exposure grows.
The closer you're getting to retirement, let's talk about that first, the less risk you should have in your corporate sponsored plan if you're working and you're contributing to a 401k, because the last thing we want is for some major market correction to come a month or two before you retire. Typically, we've pivoted our clients as we get within 6 months of retirement. We want to reduce risk as best we can. Then once you retire and you start to put a plan together, then you start taking risk exposure to certain part of your assets, but being diligent in targeting money for certain time periods. So money that we need for the next 2 to 3 years, we should have zero risk in. That should be in very liquid investments or in money markets. But beyond that, they need to have some type of investment plan. And that typically is included stocks in most of our clients' accounts. You can't get to retirement, liquidate your investments, have them sitting in money market and just start taking income off it, because eventually that money is going to be gone. You need some growth, even in your 80s and 90s. Who knows how long we're going to live unless you have some type of condition that has limited your lifespan. I mean, there's people are living into their hundreds now pretty regularly. That's something that nobody really thought of 50 years ago.
And again, that brings up the whole issue of the long-term care. You're talking about how expensive that is. How can you plan for that?
The long-term care insurance world back in 2008 and 9 really took a hard hit from regulators because the policies weren't very good. It was almost like a premium for your home where you'd pay money, and if you didn't use it, you lost all that money. The long-term care policies these days are more of an asset-backed strategy where if you don't use it, you're not losing your money, but you leverage the money that you have to buy additional insurance. So that's one strategy. There's also life insurance policies you can use for them. You can strip out money that's in your 401k and set that aside in a specific investment approach that is targeted specifically for those costs if they are incurred. Typical male is in a long-term care facility for just over 2 years. The average long-term care stay for a female is almost 7, and memory care is almost 9. If we can believe that, memory care patients are living longer in long-term care facilities than anybody. Who knows why, but for those people who need memory care, think of 9 years at 10 grand a month, how much money that would be.
Wow.
That's a lot. Yeah, I mean, that's over $1 million for somebody. So there definitely has to be planning and even good plans. If somebody's has a really bad physical, stroke. I've got a friend who 2 years ago in April, so it's 2 years and 2 months, had a major stroke and has been in care facilities ever since at 66 years old. Those stories are tragic and very difficult to plan for the extreme that he has faced, but you have to try, because if you don't, you're exposing your entire life savings to long-term care costs.
Do your clients include their children in the planning when they're going through this with you?
Most of the time, we want children to be involved with our clients once they get past retirement, usually into the early 70s, unless I feel like there's a memory issue. Anytime there's a concern that I have with a client, potentially memory concerns for them, I'm going to try and bring in their children or another person at least, that is not their spouse, in the meetings. It's very difficult to know when that time is, but you always need to be thinking that way to make sure the best interests of those clients are being taken into consideration. So it's a very important topic, and you're always, many times, there's not too many times that I can remember where the client I'm talking to and I bring up, hey, would you mind if your daughter or your son or brother, whoever it is, would you mind if we brought them into these meetings? There's not very many times that they go, yeah, that sounds like a great idea. Right? It's just, no, I don't want those types of controls, but sometimes it is absolutely necessary.
We're talking here about investments going over a number of years, plans that cover many years as we get older. What role does inflation play here?
Inflation is an incredibly important piece because it controls what things cost that we're paying for. Fortunately, on the flip side of the interest rate conversation, 80s inflation rates were in the teens. Today they're 2%. I mean, imagine a year from now if inflation rates were 10%. Everything's up 10%, and your incomes aren't growing 10% in retirement. Fortunately, today interest is 2%, so things aren't expanding in prices as much as they used to, but you still have to plan for it. I don't see a time, the last 10 years inflation has been pretty muted. I believe going forward, inflation is going to be higher than 2% over the next 4, 5, 6 years and beyond. And you have to have a plan for that, because if your money's sitting in the savings account, you're getting very little bit of interest, and a year goes by and your inflation rate is 2%, you've just lost 2% without doing anything. So you always have to take that into consideration in your investment philosophy.
And how do you counter that, or how do you deal with it?
That's the conversation of why we need equities in our investment portfolios. A nice basket of dividend-paying stocks should always be part of somebody's plan to take away inflation risk, and not just take the safe way out and put your money into a money market account or a savings account because it's safe.
Thanks, Steve. Very informative, and I appreciate that. Steve Lebens of Lebens Advisory Group. To hear more from Steve, all you have to do is subscribe to this podcast, What the Financial, by tapping the subscribe button on this page. You can also share with the share button. I'm Patrice Sikora, and let's talk again later.
Thank you for listening to What the Financial Podcast. Click the subscribe button below to be notified when new episodes become available. The information covered and posted represents the views and opinions of the guest and does not necessarily represent the views or opinions of Lebens Advisory Group LLC. The content has been made available for informational and educational purposes only. The content is not intended to be a substitute for professional investing advice. Always seek the advice of your financial advisor or other qualified financial service provider with any questions you may have regarding your investment planning.